Hi everyone, and welcome to my chat today with Jenifer Swallow, who many of you will know is a strategic advisor. She's the former CEO of LawTech UK, and her background is in fast growth tech companies. Hi Jenifer.
Hey Caroline, great to see you.
We're here to talk about 2024. Can't believe we're at the end of 2024 and some future gazing to 2025. Tell me, it's been a quite extraordinary year in many ways. Within the legal sector, it's always a sort of contradiction. I think, there's a lot of talk about change, and then behind the scenes there's not always as much change. But what's your take? I'd love to hear what your sort of assessment is of 24 and some of the milestones.
Yeah, massive in many ways. For me, I think 2024, the big one is that it was on an ethical wake-up year, particularly for the legal profession. And I think 2025 is going to be the year we actually get out of bed, or at least we're flipped out of the snooze cycle, if we could talk about it like that, because we have had Post Office, in terms of the Horizon scandal, landing so massively with the inquiry, obviously blood scandal as well. Do you know the UK was also, it fell to number 20 in Transparency International's corruption perception index this year. Can you believe that?
Wow.
That's dropped
No.
9 points in 2 years.
Yeah.
So there's something going on, right? I mean, there's something happening, and with lawyers being so in the spotlight in a lot of these corruption examples and misconduct and all these other things, I think that has been one of the massive factors for us in 2024. And the gaps are just going to get more and more unignorable. And I think really the profession is going to have to respond. I mean, next year we're going to have some this report come out from the inquiry, and I suspect it will be scathing in respect of the contribution, or otherwise the enablement, maybe is a better word, of lawyers. And there's a lot of stuff happening. There's a lot of pooling and gathering happening in the in-house community, for example, around this subject. If you watch the conference circuit as a bit of an indicator, ethics have increasingly, and a lot of us have been advocating for this, ethics has increasingly been on the agenda, and I think we're just going to see that increase. And the law firms and in-houses are going to have to build governance infrastructure that enables them, and also the regulators are going to have to lean in hard to demonstrate that independence is actually a thing, that integrity is actually a thing for this profession. So I'd say that's one massive thing.
That's amazing. I mean, you're the first person I've spoken to who's talked about ethics, and that is such a good point. I suppose, you've seen with all of those things, you've mentioned that technology was underlying some of the issues, but then also we can start to look to technology to create some of the solutions, particularly around governance.
Agree. And I think the whole where we are on AI is really interesting on that. Definitely using AI for AI governance. Also a trend we're going to see more. I've seen some really interesting tech products come out that are doing that, and that are being used by a lot of tech companies, including law techs. So I think that's really interesting. But just governance generally, and then AI. I mean, we're obviously this 2024, we were in a melee as a sector in relation to testing what you looking at use cases and testing. And I think we're going to be moving next year more into a strategic deployment, strategic approach, and that brings its own risks as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. So within these sort of investigations, that this is one of the there's lots of exciting potential use cases that we're already seeing, and I think e-discovery is one of those where you're really starting to see certainly people either looking or starting to deploy, particularly amongst the vendors rather than the end users, but these sort of the solutions where you can start to really find the needle in the haystack. I think that's something that we're going to see more of next year.
Agree. Finding the smoking guns is going to be faster, and we may see that have a massive knock-on effect for litigation, because there'll be more settlement if that's the case, if the data says. But the other part I find really interesting is, with the growth of data, there's so much information that of itself, it's almost like greater volume that the tech is going to have to find the needle in the haystack with a bigger haystack. So how is that going to play out? And I think culturally, like linking these two things together, tech and the ethics, culturally, we've got to have a look at that. How are we actually deploying tech, but how are we also, what our behaviours are around, conduct around litigation? Are we still really going to be weaponising it in the way that we were before, or are we going to play a straighter bat? And I think that's relevant to the disclosure debate, particularly. I mean, if you just took Post Office, all the machinations of what was going on in relation to disclosure, which of it was deliberate, which of it was not. I think that sort of stuff's going to be scrutinised more and more.
That's really interesting. So sort of a cultural shift, which we're starting to look at, in terms of the need for cultural shift. As a former litigator, I'll be fascinated to see whether that does actually happen, because litigation has always been that hostile sort of,
Totally.
not always, but there is that tendency, isn't there? And what's really interesting with some of the, especially in the UK, with the sort of the introduction of class actions, that's going to be really interesting to see how far we go down that road as well, and whether that has a kind of works against this idea that we might end up being a little bit more less combative.
True, and I think that the judiciary has a really interesting stakeholder in this whole thing. I mean, we saw Peter Fraser in Post Office just be scathing about the behaviour that he saw in his courtroom. And you do see increasingly judges referencing bad behaviour in judgments, which, by the way, is a data point we should be synthesising, and that should be synced back to the regulators to look at it. But you're right, if the clients are wanting really adversarial, take them down type cases, then are we just going to be in a supply and demand cycle? Or are the judges going to say, actually, not in my courtroom? So really interesting trend.
Tell me, so I've been asking people, I'd love to get your take about, we've talked a lot about Gen AI specifically this year. So, and I'm curious as to what you've seen over the year in terms of real adoption. There's a lot of, there's sort of some changes amongst the very largest firms, but I get the impression that still, that there's a lot more talk. Is that correct? I know we sort of started off touching on that, but what would be your slightly deeper assessment of that?
We're still in innovation by press release, as Richard Susskind calls it, territory. But, and actually a number of different judging competitions in the tech space, and working with Innovate UK on some of their smart grants. There's some really interesting stuff coming through, and some really great work, particularly, for example, in high volume repetitive stuff, like lease reviews and patent evaluations and stuff that really lends itself well to high data analysis. So I do think there's some really great stuff that is actually in practical use now. Clients are using it, firms are using it, and that is great. But I think we're going to see that tail extending now, so that we're going to see more and more of that. But yeah, people are still trying to figure it out. The other thing that's really interesting is next year it will be 5 years to 2030.
Yes, you said about 2030. Yes, because it's our 30th year next year.
30th anniversary. That's true.
So the Orange Leg is 30, and we're looking forward to 2030. But yeah, so tell me more about 2030.
Just that. I mean, some of the more advanced firms have been talking about 2030 for a while, but not that many really have a plan. So they've sort of got the beginnings of a plan. They're starting to think about it, but I don't know how strategic that is, or certainly how cannibalistic, should we say, of the current business model that is. I think most are taking are just more of the same and just keep working in the way that we are, because why would you stop that money, stop that money from the table? And obviously, supply and demand cycle. But I do think we're going to need, as we move closer to 2030, I think the urgency to diversify, and of course the client pressure in relation to alternative fee arrangements and different structures for pricing, when they know that their firms are using AI. I think that pressure is going to increase, but I don't think we're going to see that solved in 2025.
It's just fascinating, when you think about whether we'll finally be moving, that conversation about will we ever finally move away from the billable hour. I've had quite a few conversations about this year, and I don't feel very confident about it. But there have been some interesting models where, obviously you have that internal issue of the most senior people in a partnership model are the ones they want to invest least, and all of that, the kind of the challenges, and I've seen some interesting movement around, for example, the private equity firm that's buying out law firms, and I wonder whether, that's quite drastic, but I wonder whether we'll start to see more of that. So Lawfront is one of them. They're buying up quite big firms now, and you wonder whether you'll start to see different models coming through to help accelerate that change in structure. That would be fascinating to watch.
It will, but if clients are still prepared to pay billable hour, then that money will continue to be made in that way for as long as possible.
True.
It's all about upstream incentives, and I'm not sure they've quite changed sufficiently yet. But the other thing I think is massive is the fact that the client side, particularly on technology, has become so much more sophisticated and is increasingly so. And also general counsels, a lot of them report to CFOs. And where there's pricing pressure, then that's going to come straight down from the CFO to the GC. And I think the legal department has in the past been left alone a little bit in relation to budget, because the budget's so small compared to the big the company, client company. But I think increasingly that won't keep happening, and the pressure will precipitate into cost savings, AI strategy being deployed across all departments inside clients, greater sophistication and understanding of what's possible. So incrementally we'll see a change. And also, it's not just AI. I mean, I know we are, obsessing about AI at the moment, but there's loads of stuff happening in virtual, augmented and mixed reality. And quantum, the next phase is going to come quickly as the hype cycles do.
Well, I can't wait to catch up with you at the end of 2025. We'll have a were we right, were we wrong?
One last thing to mention is there will not be a day in 2025 when a paper doesn't write about Trump. So we are going to get to see all sorts of stuff precipitating during the next 4 years in relation to that, and the legal sector should keep a close eye on that too.
Yeah, well, thank you. Appreciate that. And there's another whole major conversation. Jenifer, always such a pleasure. Thank you so much for talking with me.
Great to see you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.